interest of time, since our speakers only have 15 minutes each, I'm not going to read a long introduction for each one, but you should be aware that in your packets you have complete biographical information. So we changed the order a little bit from the panel, the way it's presented in here. We're going to start with Eileen Martinez, who's at the end of the table. And Eileen is a journalist, so this is appropriate for our panel on media. And she's also a communications officer at the Conciliation Resources in London. And we have a PowerPoint presentation. Yes. You want me to try and find it? Okay. I have this horror, because I remember when I was giving this panel at OTJR way back, and the thing broke down, and Nikki was trying to make it work. When I came into this room, I thought, I hope I don't have to make this work. Okay. Do you want me to...
or I can stand here.
Do you want to stand here?
Yeah.
Okay. As you wish.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I will start just giving you a bit of context of the Colombian peace negotiation. We have in the country more than 50 years of armed conflict, and the peace talks between the government and the guerrilla, the FARC, started 3 years ago. And there has been moments of pessimism during this peace process. For example, when there was the end of a ceasefire, a unilateral ceasefire from the FARC, from the guerrilla, and moments of optimism during this process when the parties announced the creation of a truth commission. So these ups and downs have affected the society, and the society has witnessed an emotional roller coaster that has been shaped and that has been reflected in the media coverage. So today I'm exploring what is the role of the media in the peace negotiation, and I believe that as a Colombian that is living abroad, my perception of the peace process has been shaped by the media coverage. So I will basically cover some key items. So I will say why I believe the role of media should be to explain what is happening in the peace agreements, what has been agreed already, what are the challenges of the implementations and next steps. Also, I will give you a very quick overview of the media landscape in Colombia, so you can understand why I'm saying that educating the audience should be the primary objective and role. And then it will be followed by some recommendations and some of the challenges that I identify of media as educating the audience, and then closing with some conclusions. So I believe that the role of media should be to help the audiences to understand the past and the present of their conflict or their context. So audiences are able to imagine and build a new future. And media can do this and can help to document history and to create collective memory. And it can help to understand the challenges of the implementation. So there has been already in the peace process 3 agreements, and there is 2 more in the agenda. What are the agreements that the government and the FARC has been already discussed? Land and drugs and political participation. What are the agreements that are following, and what are the challenges of them? So really explaining to the public what are the implications of these challenges and these points of the agenda. Also, if societies are informed, they can make better decisions. At some point at the end of the agreements, the public will vote against or in favor of the agreements to approve them. That has been one of the parts of the agreements of the parties of the conflict. And if they have enough information, they can make better decisions about them. And also, if the media can explain and educate the society, it can help to open new debates about what does it mean truth, reconciliation, and justice for a society like the one in Colombia. So why I believe the media in Colombia should explain and educate the context of the armed conflict and the peace agreements. So here is a very quick overview of the media in Colombia. We have, in terms of traditional media, there is 2 main newspapers with the highest readerships in the country, and they are El Tiempo and El Espectador, and they are owned by very strong economic groups in the country, two families that have very strong political and economic power. Then we have two private media companies. One of them is Caracol and the other is RCN. And they own the TV channels with the highest audience in the country, and also the radio stations that have, again, the highest audience across the country. And then there is two stats about the penetration of this media and how many people actually consume it. So are we seeing here potentially a monopoly of information with just few groups or few families with a strong political and economic power are shaping the public agenda? So this is in terms of the traditional media. But there is also the new media that is opening opportunities with the creation of websites, debates on social media, to open multiple voices. But here we see with these stats, I just wanted to reflect that there is still a limited access to internet, and also the growth, particularly of Facebook in the Colombian society, we have seen a growth in the participation. Is still not enough, and it's less than 50% of the country that have access to internet and that is using actively social networks. So taking this in mind, and with the assumption that media help to create public perceptions and help to create public opinion, what does the public in Colombia think about the peace process? Are they supporting it or not? And here I take one sample of a survey that was done in March this year, where people were asked, what is the best option to solve the armed conflict with the FARC? And we see an increase on support of military defeat rather than the political negotiation in the last quarter of the year. In January, there was a really strong support for the political negotiation, but we see this changing. So is this connected with how is the media coverage right now, or just with the facts of what is happening in the peace process? So to try to answer that question about the change of the public perception and the decrease on the support on the peace process, I wanted to draw basically what is the media coverage like today in Colombia. This is based on a study that the Universidad Javeriana in Colombia is doing. They are doing a daily monitoring of traditional media, press, TV, and radio with the highest audiences, and they identify 4 trends in this coverage of the peace process and armed conflict in Colombia. The first one is they saw an increase on the amount of pieces of information. There are more articles, more stories out there, and that's positive. The second trend that they identify is also there is an increase on the pieces of information. They are very descriptive, some of them very short, and not enough in-depth analysis, and they do not connect with other topics that are related with the armed conflict, like distribution of land or natural resources. Also, the third trend in the traditional media coverage is that the language that is used in this information is not fully accessible. What does that mean? We are talking about concepts that are quite abstract, transitional justice or international humanitarian law. What does that really mean for a citizen? And this kind of language is not fully explained in the articles or in the pieces of information. And the final trend they have identified is that there is an emotional coverage in topics related with the armed conflict and the peace agreement, rather than a neutral and impartial one that should be the aim of journalism. And I wanted to draw your attention on this emotional coverage with one particular example. So we have here, this is from an event earlier this year, where soldiers they died after an attack by the FARC. And this is how 3 media outlets cover this event. So this is not pieces of opinion, this is just how they explain to the society what happened in these events. On the first one, which is based on a TV media outlet, the journalists use adjectives like cruel and inhuman to qualify the attacks of the guerrilla. In the second article, which is an interview with one of the mothers of one of the dead soldiers, the soldiers are portrayed as helpless victims. Something that these 2 articles or 2 media pieces of information have in common is that they just use one source of information. So they just use an official source of information, or the Minister of Defense or the Army. On the third article here, we see an attempt to give maybe a wider version of the events. This article asks not just the official version, but also some guerrilla representatives and some members of the civil society to try to understand the different versions of what happened in that event. This is a good attempt to understand the wider context, but then the language that was used across this article was still very technical, and it didn't allow people potentially to engage with the information that they were saying. So do we believe that potentially this emotional coverage is helping people to understand the past and the present of the armed conflict, or is actually maybe promoting the polarization of the society? So this is what is happening in the traditional media. Let's think now about the new media, digital, websites, social media. And I wanted to draw your attention on this particular website that is called Verdad Abierta. And this is a website that is trying to do an in-depth analysis of very complex topics of the armed conflict, such as what is the history, who are the actors of the armed conflict, what does it mean transitional justice, what are the victims' point of view. So they are giving this explanation. However, it doesn't have the wider reach as the traditional media. Then also the parties of the armed conflict are doing an attempt to explain what is happening in the agreement. The government, a couple of months ago, launched an online course where they are explaining the agreements they have arranged, and they are explaining how they come about and topics that are connected. And also the FARC is doing a weekly news broadcast on YouTube when they explain their evolution on the peace process and some of the challenges. So it seems like in new media we have more, maybe in-depth analysis and multiple voices, but let's remember, does it reach the wider Colombian society, or maybe should traditional media amplify these initiatives and help or learn from them and create their own? Then how could media potentially improve to help people understand what is happening in the conflict? And I wanted to draw here just 4 initiatives that are happening in the country right now. So this is showing us how media can appeal to multiple voices to show different sectors of the society. And this is a website that is portraying the story of Rosa. And Rosa is a woman that fights for victims' rights and is using podcasts, video, features, articles to shape her story from people that are around her and from her own voice. Also, media could appeal to show civil society initiatives and not just the versions of the actors of the armed conflict. Because if media does this, it will reinforce the idea that actually peace won't be signed in the Havana peace talks. It's also a responsibility of the society. This is an example of El Tiempo Online, where they choose 5 videos to show initiatives of how theater and art are helping to create peace in different localities. Then also, media could create or support pedagogic initiatives that help to understand concepts that are very abstract and that don't mean anything for people that are not specialists, like transitional justice, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. What does that mean for the common citizen? This is a very good initiative that is aimed to journalists in Colombia, and they are providing tools and webinars to explain the meaning of these concepts. But how can we make this wider and more accessible for the rest of the society? And then finally, the international society community has very rich experiences, and potentially Colombia could draw on the initiatives and on some examples to learn potentially of what can be done and how to explain different contexts. And Justice Info, I believe, it could become as a go-to resource where national and local media in Colombia could connect with an international society and actually exchange ideas and knowledge. So in terms of the challenges, we just go very quickly through them of the media as explaining and educating the society. We have first the security. There is still an armed conflict in Colombia. The fact that it's a peace agreement, it doesn't mean there is a ceasefire. So we need to bear in mind the risks of people's lives. The second challenge is in terms of the independence, particularly independence of information in a country where big and traditional media are owned by families or political and economic groups. A way to mitigate, to overcome this challenge potentially is increasing the reach of new media that is showing new voices. Then the quality of information, we have seen that more initiatives are moving towards digital media, where everybody can become a content creator. How can we ensure the quality of the information they are making? Maybe involving communications professionals and journalists in these initiatives to explain the civil society what the peace agreements can help us to mitigate this challenge. And then finally, the public fatigue. How can we make the people gain interest in this topic if we are showing them the same story every day? And here is a very interesting quote, and I believe a way to overcome this challenge is to use creativity, new narratives, but more important, potentially use human voices to portray the story. And as a conclusion, just to summarize what the role of media should be in the Colombian peace negotiations, it should be to explain and educate, because like that it can help and empower the public to make better decisions. So when they are asked about if they want to approve or reject the agreements, they can understand what are the implications. Also to use new debates about what do Colombian society believe that what it means for them, truth, reconciliation, and justice. And ultimately, media can help to understand their past and the present so people can imagine new futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. And you opened up a lot of very important points. I'm sure we'll come back and later on and also in the breakout sessions. Diana Dackett is our next speaker. You also have a PowerPoint, right? Okay, let's see if we can bring it up. Panic. Diana is the former advisor on the peace process to the Colombian Minister of Interior, but she's currently a student in the master's program at the Colombian School of Governance and entering in the autumn in the DPhil in socio-legal studies, so we get to keep her in the transitional justice group. Thank you, Diana.
Well, thank you very much, Lee, and to the OTGR community and to the University of Oxford for giving me the chance of exploring a little bit the relationships between media, academia, and practice. And moving forward, Eileen's excellent presentation, she drew upon some challenges and opportunities and different recommendations on the role of media in Colombia. I will also explore some of these questions with an overarching remark, which is that in Colombia particularly, we have the twofold situation of having a media that is covering conflict and that is covering peace. And that draws particular challenges and opportunities. For those of you that are not aware with Colombian conflict, we have been having communist guerrillas since almost 60 years ago. And from that period, we also had some paramilitaries who we also had a peace process with, and we are now exploring negotiations with FARC guerrilla and are about to enter with negotiations to ELN guerrilla, which is also a communist guerrilla. So in that big framework, we're both having the condition of the need of covering peace building and covering conflict. So that's why I want to draw upon attention of the particularities of Colombian case and some challenges and opportunities that journalists have in Colombia as having the need to cover conflict and the need of covering peace building. And this twofold condition brings some challenges that I would like to draw upon, quoting some examples. The first challenge of covering conflict is that journalists are also victims. And I want to draw upon four different cases that show the complexity of journalists being victim in conflict. The first of all, this guy that is in the picture is Guillermo Cano. He was the director of El Espectador, which is one of the biggest media journals, newspapers in Colombia. and he was killed in the 80s by drug traffickers because he had a very strong line in El Espectador against drug trafficking. Later on, El Espectador had a bomb attack, and you can see there the offices of El Espectador. Again, because they had a strong position against drug trafficking. And this was in the 80s, but more recently, the woman that is in the left is called Ginette Bedoya. She's a very strong and amazing woman that has been a journalist in conflict in Colombia. And she has been kidnapped and violated by the paramilitary groups for her strong positions in conflict. So you can see how difficult it is for journalists to cover war. And you have also Romeo Langlois. He's a French journalist who was in Colombia in 2012 covering conflict. And he was kidnapped by FARC guerrilla during an attack to the Colombian army. So this is a big challenge that Colombia is facing today, how to have an independent media, as Eileen was saying, which is very important, but taking into account that journalists are also victims. Another big challenge is that, as you are aware, the role of media is to tell the facts, to tell the truth. However, sadly, in Colombia, we have a huge debate after 60 years of conflict about what the truth is and whose the truth it is. When Romeo Langlois was liberated by FARC guerrillas, one of his first remarks was the need of not only covering the sources of the official army or the institutions for taking account of the conflict. He also said that it was very important to engage with FARC, with paramilitaries, to have an overall truth of the conflict. And in response to his remarks, Uribe, the former president of Colombia, was very critical, and he said that Romeo Langlois was being somehow a friend of the FARC guerrillas. So you can see there that the truth is very disputed in Colombia, and because of that, we have also a really strong challenge on who the truth it is. So that's another big remark on covering conflict. Another important remark is that in Colombia, we have so many things happening in all country. It's a very big country with more than 40 people of population. So there are lots of things happening, not only about peace, but about economy, about ecology, about political news. So there's always a need of the latest news. And even, this is a funny fact, but even some years ago, one of the leaders of the guerrilla group of FARC, which is Alfonso Cano, you can see him in the picture that is over there, he was attacked by the Colombian army. And one newspaper, which is now an alternative media, very good one, but in that time they made a mistake, which was because of the quest of the latest truth. They said that Alfonso Cano had died in the attack when he hadn't. So you can see there how complex it is, this race for having always the latest news, which also affects the quality of information and the profound of the analysis. You can see in the other picture one of the previous failed attempts of peace in Colombia, which was between the presidency of Andrés Pastrana, which was the president before Álvaro Uribe. And this is a very symbolic act. He was signed by the FARC to the territory where the peace conversations were taking place, but the FARC commandant never came. So it's very symbolic. It was an opportunity for the media not just to cover the act, but also to go deeper, maybe put some pressure to save the process. But because of all these quests and, well, also lots of things surrounding the process, you can see always how challenging it is to cover deeply the conflict when there is this race for information. However, there are good news. There are also opportunities of covering the Colombian armed conflict, and I want to outline 3 opportunities. The first one is to be a voice against impunity. After 60 years of war, you can imagine that there are lots of crimes that have been committed. Actually, right now, the official accounts of victims said that there are 7 million victims in Colombia, which is a lot. And one thing that media can do especially well is to draw attention on those cases of impunity. And even though it has passed 20 years, call the attention that there are no sentences on the specific cases, and that there are still some people that haven't been tried. Likewise, they are a voice against oblivion, which is also very important given the fact that journalists are also victims. The picture that you see there is a conference called Journalist Damage, Memory and Reparation, which was very symbolic because now journalists are recognized as a collective group of victims in Colombia, and the unity of victims are doing very important efforts to repair that damage, not only in a material way, but also in a symbolic way. And one way of doing that is raising the voice of the issue and doing these kinds of conversations to draw attention of the fact that we cannot forget about the different atrocities that have been committed by years and years and years of conflict. The last opportunity is that they are also a voice for truth. And even though, as I said before, a huge challenge is the attribution of truth and the dimension and profundity of it, it's also an opportunity. I like very much this photo that you see there. It says that you cannot kill truth by killing journalists. And this is highly important, taking into account that has been kind of the fact in Colombia. So it's very important to take into account that this is an opportunity to give voice of truth. And I also want to highlight very briefly the role of media in their coverage of peace building, and also 3 challenges and 3 opportunities. In terms of challenges, as Eileen was saying, communicating peace building is very technical in Colombia. You can see this is the first page of the document of the Historic Commission of Conflict in Colombia, which has 809 pages. This is supposed to give a general account of the conflict, and it's just an initial effort. And communicating that to the public, it's just an exhausting effort, and we need lots of imagination from journalists to try to communicate that to the public. You can also imagine that is also the case for legal information. Concepts like transitional justice are just too technical to communicate. Also, we have a highly polarized society right now, and polarization sells. So a really important challenge is for media to try to not be part of that polarization, and even with the language, try to be a little bit softer. And there is also taking into account that the conversations are confidential. There is a lot of prudency that must be maintained, and that is a huge challenge for journalists. But there are also some opportunities, as I was saying. The first one is that this is an opportunity to have a more informed public opinion. As Eileen was saying, there is the initiative of how to cover the peace process, which is very important. They have been doing workshops with journalists at the local level in Colombia to make them understand all the technicalities behind the peace process. And there's also an independent journal of La Silla Vacía, which is called the Peace, the Chair of Peace. You can translate it like that. But it's like a way to translating all the technical discussions in a more digestible language. Media has also the opportunity of highlighting victims and society's concerns, which is very important because there are lots of things that need to be discussed right now, and media is the mean to do so. And lastly, it's an opportunity to boost democracy. Colombia is facing a huge challenge trying to engage citizen participation in peace process. And Colombia is actually pioneer in building initiatives to engage citizens to actually construct peace building policies. And the first way to do so is to engage public participation. And who talks to the citizens? The media. So it's very important that the media engage in these efforts. This is an overview. You can imagine that there are lots of challenges, lots of opportunities. I just wanted to highlight you some of them so we can have some remarks for our discussion in the workshop. I'll be happy to answer some of your questions later on, but I will just like to outline to finish 3 remarks. The first one is that peace building from the bottom up needs journalism from the bottom up. Which is very important. As Aline was saying, right now in Colombia, we have lots of top-down media, and what is trying to happen right now in Colombia with the new initiatives is to create a journalism from the bottom up, and that's why there have been so much engagement with journalism in the regions. Likewise, journalism for democracy needs a strong partnership between academia, media and practice, and this is how where we all, the people sitting here, need to engage and work hard to understand our language, which are sometimes different, and also understand our different roles and ways of thinking and engaging with the public. And lastly, I would like to finish with this quote that I found very interesting from Maria Jimena Duzan, which is a journalist in Colombia. It's from a column published yesterday. Moments of definite crisis need political imagination. And that's the call for media today, to be imaginative enough to boost and encourage citizen participation so we can create a better future. Thank you very much.
Diana, you both are very punctual. Thank you also for that. And we'll see if Roddy can also read. Well, no PowerPoint. So, okay.
So we
yes,
can sit here.
you can sit there, or you can stand if whichever you prefer. Our last speaker on the panel is Roddy Brett, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of St. Andrews, but he's been visiting in the Latin American Center at the University of Oxford for the year, and we've enjoyed having his participation throughout. He's also an advisor to the Institute of Humanitarian Studies of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Bogota, Colombia.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lee. Thanks for hosting me, and of course, thanks to OTJI for this great invitation. 2 really tough acts to follow, actually, and no PowerPoint, so you're going to have to look at each other, I suspect. So what I want to do is, this is really not my field of research, so it's a way out of my comfort zone. But what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the relationship between the media and victims in a context of transitional justice or peace building or post-conflict reconstruction. Essentially, this is based... I had the privilege recently of leading a UN investigation into the role of victims in the peace building and peace process in Colombia at the moment. We didn't mention this already, but in June 2014, so a year ago more or less, the parties to the negotiation and to the conflict, of course, ended up, as a result of a really long process that we can talk about if we want to in the Q&A, inviting victims, direct victims of Colombia's armed conflict, to participate in the negotiating table. Okay, so basically 5 delegations were invited of 12 people each, so you have 60 individuals, obviously of a universe of around 7 million victims. So it ain't representative, but it was supposed to at least give a taste to the parties to the conflict. They were very carefully chosen, and again, we can go into that if we're interested in the Q&A. So I'm basically leading the research investigation into whether or not this made any difference whatsoever to the peace process. Okay, and of course, in this regard, what is really interesting are the perspectives of those victims that took part in the delegations in Havana. The peace process is in Havana, it's not in Colombia. Their perspectives with regards to the media and what the media did or didn't contribute to the peace-building process and to their participation. So I guess I want just to start with an obvious but a sort of general point. Part of the workshop is to look at the degree to which the media has the power to create collective narratives around the conflict, and that this can either enhance or impede the peace process. Can build consensus or it can polarize debate, right? Which is what our two speakers looked very interestingly at. But obviously, and I want to make this point, the media in itself will ultimately reflect the deeper structural context in which it's located or situated, the social, political and economic formations within a society. In the case of Latin America, and this was alluded to by Eileen, and specifically in the case of Colombia, we have a very restricted ownership of the media, so this monopoly is crucial, leading to self-censorship, to market-driven censorship, or direct censorship. At the same time, you have a very limited access for vulnerable or oppositional groups to the mainstream media, okay, which is why very often you have an interesting sort of alternative set of medias developing. And I think that actually reflects the closure of the political system to such groups. So it's related directly, and the closure of the political system to vulnerable or oppositional groups has ultimately been a motor for conflict in itself, right? So that's something just to get out of the way in the first place. As both of our speakers alluded to, Colombia and Latin America more generally, we see journalists and freedom of speech, again generally, as a victim of the armed conflict and of authoritarian regimes. In Colombia, for example, between 1977 and 2015, according to the Foundation for the Freedom of the Press, we have 143 journalists that were killed by different armed groups. But that's, in a sense, augmented by the fact you have thousands upon thousands of death threats, kidnappings, intimidations of journalists. And you look exactly, the question of Ginette Bedoya, very important, and the bombing of the Espectador newspaper in 1989. So I think at the same time, the mainstream media, as you both alluded to also, has played a key role in building consensus regarding which violent actors are socially acceptable and therefore, to a certain degree, should be subject to transitional justice mechanisms, and which episodes of violence are worthy of media coverage and which should be silenced. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail in a moment. There's a really interesting interview that was carried out by Claudia Gurisati, who I think is the director of RCN, or Caracol, RCN, which is one of the big mainstream media outlets. She interviewed Carlos Castaño, who was one of the founders of the paramilitaries. And to say it was uncritical would be a massive understatement. I mean, it was orgasmic, actually, watching her speak to Carlos Castaño, as my wife said to me last night. So the question of bias is massive, obviously, in Colombia. So I guess from here, the first point I want to make is, whilst we can't go as far as saying that the media is a direct perpetrator in the armed conflict, obviously, it's clearly played a role in the armed conflict. And as Aida Abello, who was one of the victims who went to the delegations to the peace process in Cuba, said to me recently, she was the president, or is the president, of a political party called the Patriotic Union, which re-emerged after its political genocide against it in the 1980s and 1990s. Aida said to me the following: "The media is a key actor in the conflict and should participate in any transitional justice mechanisms that are elaborated, both as victim and as perpetrator, for example, truth commissions. The wickedness, as she calls it, with which large media outlets such as Caracol and RCN have handled the conflict is grave. I listened to war reporters whose news editors told them they had to change their story because of its focus on particular victims. Many refused and were fired. At that time, mainstream media outlets had military officials who would say which news could be published and which could not. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, I think. So the second point then, related to that I want to make, is this question of access to the media. A senior UN official that I spoke to during this research project said to me that he believes that not all Colombian media, as he puts it, is run by a corrupt oligarchy. And he says really that what you do see, and I think you made this point very well, Eileen, is that there is quite a diversity in the media. Not all of it is incredibly biased, as it is, for example, in the case of Guatemala or El Salvador. But what he did say, and I think this is important, is that some people, and in this particular case victims, have better access to the media than others. And he would say the following, and I'm citing him, "It's not the displaced people in Tumaco, it's not the indigenous in Cauca who have the best access to the media. It is, and with all due respect, the victims from other social strata that do have access to the media." So there's a relationship, in a sense, between elite families, the far right and their potential access to the media, and those who are in the vulnerable oppositional groups that don't have that access. So therefore, many stories are covered, and Aida Bello talked about this. The massacres, for example, of the Unión Patriótica, of our political party, weren't covered in the media in the 1980s and the 1990s. Completely silenced. So this then, in that regard, I think leads to the next reflection, which is the role of alternative media, including social media, in building peace, and particularly in the current peace process. Colombia, as Eileen mentioned, has a series of really interesting semi-autonomous, independent websites and news outlets that have really done very interesting work on peace building, on transitional justice. Verdad Abierta, Las Dos Orillas, which is a new organisation recently, Razón Pública, La Silla Vacía. They're worth looking at. I think they're very good. These outlets have been critical very often and actually seek to bring in the voice of victims and alternative narratives regarding the conflict into the broader context, in particular concerning the role and impact of paramilitaries. Okay, so as you were saying, the soldiers are heroic. The killing of them by the military is also, but when you look at the question of paramilitary killings, that's very often excluded. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that we need to start thinking about a point that Diana raised, which is what's going on in the regions of Colombia. In the peace process at the moment, there's a crucial focus, allegedly, on the importance of the regions. It's a very big country, it's a very regionalised country. And what Sergio Jaramillo, who's the peace commissioner who was here in Oxford a month or so ago, the UN and other actors have said, is that peace can only be built from the regions. That's where you start building a meaningful peace. So I want to focus on that for the rest of the talk, and that and alternative media. So I want to refer to the work of an organisation called the Collective of Journalists from Montes de Maria, which is a zone in the Atlantic coast of Colombia. So this group was founded in the 1990s and has played a crucial role in trying to maintain cohesion in conflict-torn countries and latterly to kickstart reconciliation in these local communities. So I interviewed one of their members called Soraya Bayuelo, and she said to me the following, that basically at the height of guerrilla and paramilitary violence in the 90s and early 2000s, it had been impossible to do any sort of meaningful media work, right? So they were forced underground, and they could do no political analysis, no discussions of the situation of the armed conflict, and focused on very kind of day-to-day issues. But slowly they decided they wouldn't be silenced, and they really moved towards engaging with victims' issues. And they'd started to do a really interesting strategy, which was basically start to show films in local communities, in the central plaza of local communities. At the beginning, they weren't political films at all. There was one Central Station, which is a Brazilian film, which is very interesting. And what they started to do was just to get people to come and watch the movies. Okay, at the end of the first movie, everyone just went home immediately. There was no discussion. The second movie, and they would do it more or less immediately after bombing attacks or killings had taken place in the communities, right? bit by bit, people would hang around a bit afterwards. They'd take a coffee, they'd start talking about the film, and so they then started to show more political films, and it begins to develop. And what she says is that the role of the media, or alternative local level media, in this context is to build citizenship, is to start reflecting upon the context in which they're living. So the final point then, I think, to make is really about the importance of social media. And I would say the following, and it's an obvious point, but it's worth making. Social media isn't just inherently democratic, just because any bod can fire a tweet off from anywhere, okay? The really important example I want to focus on, one of the victims is called Angela Maria Giraldo. She went in the first delegation to Havana last year. She was the sister of someone who had been kidnapped by the FARC and was subsequently executed by the FARC in 2007. Spent a lot of time with Angela, and we were talking a lot about this issue. And she said to me that when she'd come back from Cuba, she was faced immediately on Twitter, of all places, by a barrage of disinformation, of abuse, of threats. And the really sort of most important one to mention is that a congressional deputy of Uribe's party, ¿cómo es? Centro Democrático? Democratic Center, essentially Maria Fernanda Cabral had posted a photo of Angela shaking hands with somebody in Havana, right? And it said underneath it, the line it said was the following. The post read, "This victim, in inverted commas, is very happy greeting the FARC. Does she have Stockholm syndrome?" Okay. Now, obviously for Angela, this was really serious and very, very disturbing and precipitated all sorts of other threats and discussions. Ironically, the person wasn't even a member of the FARC. He was from the government delegation. But I think what this demonstrates is that social media in the context of Colombia's current peace process has also been used to politicize and to re-victimize the victims. And that's taken place very often. I was just writing up the report yesterday. 40% of the victims that went to Havana and came back have received either death threats or intimidations, etc. So, to end then, I guess, social media, and more generally the media, can play both a negative and a positive role within the framework of transitional justice and post-conflict reconstruction, and in this context, the Colombian peace process. At the same time, media has often acted as a terrain of contestation between spoiling actors and those that support the peace process. Right? The media has represented, I think, a thermometer for Colombia's peace process, but at the same time, it's represented a thermometer for testing the nature and stability of what could be Colombia's post-conflict scenario. So here I'll come back to my first point in order to end. I think given the significance, and this was likely something that will come up during the next couple of days, given the significance of the media as an actor in these contexts, I'd come back to Aida Abeo's words, which is it's crucial that they're taken into account in any transitional justice mechanisms, right? Be they be truth commissions or otherwise. So, and it's crucial that the media is contemplated within these mechanisms as a victim, as an indirect perpetrator, and as a spoiler. Okay, I'll finish there.